What's up, chooms? Welcome back to Darth Matu's Holocron, the spot where you can explore the dark future. That's right, we're back today with another Cyberpunk lore video. This time we're going to be breaking down the more regional timeline for the EEC, otherwise known as the European Economic Community, Cyberpunk's very own version of the real-life European Union. Europe leads the world in Cyberpunk, fully shouldering the burden of being the West's superpower. But don't think it's all roses and rainbows. The EEC is most times an Orwellian hellhole, and that's the nice part of town. Now, we've already talked about the slow decline of the US and the Gang of Four who seized power there in 1990. Things in Europe, on the other hand, were better. They entered a period of economic prosperity while America was sliding backwards. And it wasn't an equal prosperity. Of course. Countries like Germany, France, England, they had far more than poor countries like Greece. And a solution was finally settled on that was much like our own European Union in real life. The countries of Europe would unite their economies into one, creating a single cohesive economic unit for the continent. On paper, this would have allowed the richer countries to pour money into the less developed nations, bringing them on par. So in 1992, Europe voted to formally create the European Economic Council, or the EEC. The EEC was built around a currency that was known as the euro dollar, or the eddy for short. The EEC was led by the European Council. Member nations retained their autonomy, electing local politicians to manage the same way as before. But the best local politicians were selected to step up to the Euro Council, the ruling body for the EEC. Each nation received one representative for every 100 million euro dollars that they contributed into the economy, which led to richer nations having vastly disproportional representation compared to poorer states. Constituencies were decided based on tax income, which meant that the wealthiest suburbs would sometimes have councillors, while entire poor cities would not. The council currently has 536 seats. At least they did as of 2022, which is the last time I can find a number for it. If one of you guys knows better, then please correct me, but as of 2077, I believe they still have 536 seats. The council is led by a speaker and an assistant speaker, both of which are selected by majority vote from the council. The highest level of the council is known as the Secretariat, and the commissioners lead the Secretariat, with commissioners hand-selecting counselors to join the Secretariat. It's the purpose of this group to put aside personal goals and to focus on the wider European view, and they represent the EEC internationally. Commissioners also have the added authority and responsibility of ensuring that their specific commission is functioning according to European well-being. Members of the Secretariat are the most well-paid, most powerful politicians on Earth, and they use their power to further cement their own position in a cycle of corruption that began almost as soon as the EEC did. The Gang of Four, like we talked about in our last video, did not take the formation of a rival trade currency lying down. They began a series of covert digital actions against the EEC, artificially hobbling the burgeoning eddy. These actions would become known as the Quiet War, and they would continue well into 1996. This, on top of the natural troubles that came from unifying dozens of disparate economies, kept the eddy from taking off for some time. The EEC was slow to cement its control. It took a lot of work to bring all these disparate nations into some type of cohesive element, and it was turbulent, to say the least. The four core nations of the EEC, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, and Germany, actually began to institute an early version of what would become a program called Fortress Europe. They sealed their borders against migrants from the other European countries, preventing what they saw as riffraff from taking advantage of their home nations. Now, this was in direct violation of the treaty that bound the EEC together, but because these were the richest nations and they had the most representation in the European Council, nothing was done about it. 1993 was the year that the EEC began to truly get its feet. Interpol was given authority to act as the EEC's law enforcement and intelligence agency, not just in Europe, but abroad as well, and they changed their name to Europol. The biologic interface chip, a human-machine interface that would become the basis of future cybernetics, was successfully developed in Munich, and the EEC stood poised to become a world power. Despite these successes, however, the Quiet War continued to take its toll. The EEC finally managed to gain uncontrovertible proof of the Gang of Four's actions against the Eurodollar, and they leaked this information to the public, confident that the EEC was strong enough to weather whatever storm was to come. They were wrong. The panic caused by the revelation that major international currency values had been artificially manipulated for years caused the collapse, a complete dropout of the world financial markets. Now, we've talked about the collapse in other videos, but suffice it to say, the US dollar was almost completely destroyed, and the Eurodollar suffered as well. The EEC was able to weather the storm better than others, but they were not left completely unaffected, and the result of economic turmoil was corruption that allowed corporations to worm their way into Europe. Outside of Europe, whole economies disappeared overnight. Millions of refugees began to flee for safer, more prosperous nations, and Europe began to enforce its borders with the military, much the way that the Core 4 had in the year before. Fortress Europe began to become an official EEC policy, with the EEC military killing thousands of refugees at the border, blowing them out of the water on boats, or gunning them down within a kill zone that was established on either side of a wall. At the same time, the economic strain began to tell in some of the poorer nations, and Poland fell into martial law by the end of the year. 1995 was notable for the steep increase in efforts to enforce Fortress Europe. The European Space Agency was used to install a network of satellites that kept the EEC and its borders under constant watch from above. An ID card system was instituted, with all citizens forced to carry one at all times. These cards had fingerprints, profession, health status, licenses, all scannable by law enforcement on demand. These draconian measures were seen as harsh by human rights groups, but they did work to help the EEC stem the endless flow of refugees. The Iran-Iraq War spiraled out of control in 1997, which caused the Mideast meltdown, a nuclear exchange that turned most of the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula into radioactive glass. Fallout spread across the entire region, and refugees fled into Europe again. They poured from Turkey into Greece, and battles erupted all along the border as the EEC fought to keep the Turks out. The weather took a turn for the worse that spring, with a wave of hurricanes devastating the coast. Germany was forced to abandon the coastal areas, and the EEC made plans to install a system of dams and dikes to hold back the rising sea. A devastating earthquake also struck by the end of that year in the Bay of Biscay. Tsunamis devastated the coastal areas even further. The following years consisted of actions against criminal activity and slow recovery from the turmoil of the early 90s. The Europol agency became stronger than ever, and they were thrust into a series of covert conflicts that were known as the Shadow War. The Shadow War began with the Knights of Fire, which was a KGB coup in the USSR. The KGB, which was then backed by the Russian mafia, attempted to expand into the EEC, which drew them into action against Europol. Europol would eventually beat back the attempts of the mafia to gain a foothold in Eastern Europe, and the EEC would turn its attention back to the stars. The European Space Agency scored a major win in 1999 with the official establishment of their moon colony, Tycho Colony. The moon colony only has a few hundred people on it, but it is also the site of a prototype mass driver, a weapon capable of accelerating rock to a percentage of the speed of light and targeting the planet beneath the moon. The EEC was again feeling very strong, and they began to take action against the corporations that had wormed their way into their midst, breaking up several smaller companies who tried to dictate contract prices. The ESA capitalized on the success of the colony at Tycho and began the construction of a massive space station at Lagrange Point 1, a place of stable gravity between the Earth and the Moon. This station would become known as the Crystal Palace, and it would become foundational to global power structure even into 2077. But, yet again, progress would be set back by happenstance. Millennium cults had spread across the world, and we spoke a bit about those groups before in the Eagle Falls video. These cults believed that the approach of the year 2000 heralded the end of the world, and many of them even worked to actively hasten this end. The world's biggest rave was held on New Year's in Berlin, where fanatics would use the opportunity to strike, releasing nerve gases into the packed celebrations, killing as much as 19,000 people. The EEC responded by clamping down on dissidents within its borders, just in time for the wasting plague to hit. The wasting plague was a serious disease which struck the victim's digestive system, blocking the intake of nutrients. Essentially, the afflicted starved to death, no matter how much food they ate. Millions of people died in Europe and the US, and the outbreak of the disease pushed the EEC to completely close its borders. Fortress Europe had been a loose policy for years, but it now became absolute. The border to the EEC morphing into a kind of reverse Iron Curtain, an impassable barrier defended by the military that kept the rest of the world out. These draconian measures worked to slow the spread of the plague, and soon after, the bioweapons lab at Neustrelitz in Brandenburg was able to develop a cure, ending the pandemic. Things continued to spiral, however, despite the quick response to the plague. Many people had died, and natural disaster struck once more, with the Santorini volcano in the Aegean Sea erupting in 2002. Tidal waves again devastated the region, and on top of that, several local governments began to collapse as corruption was brought to light. The parliament in Spain completely broke down, and Portugal outright outsourced their national security to large corporations like Arasaka. EEC weapons manufacturers got involved in the South American conflict, selling weapons to South American countries and making enormous profits, becoming extremely powerful as a result. Europe began to cement as a totalitarian state, and the Council struggled to ensure that the EEC government came up in control of that system over the corporations. The first corporate war broke out in 2004, with European companies involved front and center in the fiasco. This scandal, combined with media reports revealing the deep level of corruption within the Council, led to mass protests across Europe. Citizens refused to pay their taxes en masse, which forced the EEC to respond. The Council was forced to restructure the entire government in response to the corruption and in order to appease the people. However, despite supposed reforms, corruption proved much harder to remove than initially anticipated. A campaign began to legalize several major criminal syndicates, including the Sicilian Mafia. These groups wanted to enter the government legally as political parties, and they began to see success in this endeavor, prompting the formation of new criminal groups, such as the Nuova Mafia. We'll take a closer look at organized crime in a future video, but for now, it's just important to remember that despite government pushes to clean out corruption, new sources of it were constantly springing up. This would truly become apparent in 2007 with the outbreak of the Second Corporate War. Many national governments, including ones in the EEC, openly backed one side or the other, dragging member nations of the community into yet more conflict. Meanwhile, the European Space Agency continued to push the bounds of human progress, and they set up a joint EEC-Soviet mission to Mars. Operation Green Man was begun in 2006. This was a program that was meant to create more intelligent, hardier humans that were fit to colonize other worlds. This program utilized a mix of selective breeding and genetic modification to push the frontiers of human anatomy. Construction continued on the Crystal Palace at the same time, and combined with the ESA's real estate on the Moon and at other Lagrange points in orbit, the EEC's orbital footprint was rapidly becoming the foundation of their global power. Meanwhile, the US, still ruled by the Gang of Four, was fading. They knew they had to gain headway in space or fall behind forever, so the US launched an attack on a Soviet orbital platform in 2008, hoping to seize it as their own and thus prop up their own waning global power. This short conflict was known as the Orbital War, and it was over almost before it began. The EEC intervened on the side of the Soviets, using the mass driver outside Tycho Colony to drop an asteroid on Colorado Springs, completely destroying the city and devastating the surrounding area. The US was forced to peace talks, and their international hegemony was broken forever. The EEC moved to take America's place as the world's strongest superpower. There was one last final attempt by the Gang of Four to break into the space race in 2009 when they made a play to take over the Crystal Palace, but the EEC discovered this plot and dropped another asteroid off the coast of Washington as a warning, forcing the US to back down yet again. The EEC had never been stronger abroad, but things were still spiraling within its sealed borders. Corporations continued to make gains, despite reforms. Agri-companies put increasing pressure on governments in a bid to gain land, and in 2008, the Portuguese government literally sold their entire country. Yeah, not making that up. They sold Portugal to agri-companies. The Greek government also collapsed in 2007 and was replaced by a military junta. In 2008, this junta launched a campaign of military domination in a bid to seize both Cyprus and Macedonia, which divided Europe as countries backed either the new government in Greece or the government in exile, which was functioning out of Rhodes. The Greek military campaigns, rather than being quick victories against weak opponents, would become slogs, and eventually, most nations in the EEC would swing their support behind the government in exile, ending the conflict by the end of 2009. The trend of corporate buyout continued in Italy and other countries, and large parts of the North were bought out by agri-companies. The second decade of the new millennium was just as turbulent as the first. Corporate buyout continued, spreading into southern Italy by this point, and Operation Green Man was leaked to the public in 2012, which caused mass protests again within the EEC. The Great Drought began in 2013, with large areas of Spain becoming little more than desert. Corporate warfare would rage across Andalusia, but the EEC would step in hard and put an end to the fighting, very eager not to repeat the mistakes of the Second Corporate War. The Catholic Church went through a major reformation in 2014, ending the long tradition of celibacy and finally allowing women to become priests. Sporadic fighting between Eastern European nations would continue well into 2015, and the trend of cyber mercenaries engaging in the petty nationalistic struggles between countries became endemic. The EEC would respond by banning the use of military cyberware by private persons, and they would heavily regulate any chrome already on the market. The Third Corporate War would break out in 2016, devastating nations yet again, but this conflict was different from the wars of the past in that it was almost entirely fought on the digital realm, across the net. Netrunners broke into infrastructure, shut off lights and water, and weakened the stability between nations. Europol would receive permission from the Council to increase their persecution of cybercrime as a result, which in turn would lay the foundation of Netwatch. Southern Italy was placed under martial law in 2018, and they remain under martial law even in 2077. Things would truly boil over at the end of 2018 with the start of a series of conflicts called the European Brushfire Wars. Now, these were low-end conflicts between the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. They were basically engaging in military games in violation of the EEC treaty, basically trying to get one over on one another while they could. The European Space Agency continued to make gains during this time, with 2 successful missions to Mars and several other orbital stations outside the Crystal Palace, like I mentioned. They would launch a mission to Jupiter in 2018, confident in their recent gains. But things would begin to come undone in 2019 as civil unrest boiled over in the orbital colonies. Space colonies at Lagrange points 3, 4, and 5 would all revolt, and these space stations would end up declaring their independence under the moniker of the High Riders. Now, we're going to talk about the High Riders in their own video, but suffice it to say, they were a unique culture that had developed aboard the enormous stations that had encircled the Earth. The ESA also saw renewed competition from NASA, with the American Space Agency successfully establishing their own colony on Mars in 2021. The death of Raish Bartmoss and the subsequent collapse of the net came in 2022, and quickly on the heels of this disaster, the Fourth Corporate War. As we discussed in other videos, the Fourth Corporate War was waged between Arasaka and Militech, and it proved to be the most devastating of all of them. Designer plagues ravaged port towns across the world, smart minds escaped corporate control, populated the oceans, and made them nearly impassable. Renewed orbital unrest would occur in late 2022, with rebel groups seizing the chance to declare independence in what became known as the 7-Hour War, a conflict we will discuss much more in the High Rider video. At the end of this short war, however, O'Neill 2 and Galileo Cylinder were both free, and had joined the High Riders. The environment on Earth was devastated, and this kicked off the time of the Red by 2023, a period of 2 years where the sky was colored blood red. And you still get red sunrises and sunsets even in 2077. The Night City Holocaust, the nuking of Arasaka headquarters on August 20th, 2023, gave the EEC the reason it needed to finally strike back in a real way against the corporate influence that had plagued it for so long. They nationalized Militech and Arasaka assets within their borders, seizing direct government control and bringing the corporations firmly under the heel of the Secretariat. The US followed suit, and then the rest of the world, and by 2025, the Fourth Corporate War was officially over, the world struggling to continue. Things in the European economic community would stabilize after the Fourth Corporate War, more or less. Fortress Europe remained strong, and kept the instability in the rest of the world from overrunning the rich nations of Europe. Small conflicts between member nations of the EEC would continue, and the ESA would lose ground in orbit. But despite this, they would stay on top. A colonial government was set up on Mars, and prosperity in the main nations of the EEC grew out of control. European society became cloistered and tightly monitored. Fortress Europe and the ID system allowed the government to regulate everyday life to levels never before seen in history. Getting into Europe can take days, with entire industries springing up to support those who are stuck in line. Once in Europe, an individual is constantly tracked, if not by constant overhead monitoring via satellite, then by the tracker in their ID card. People who play by the rules can do well, becoming rich or finding their way into the most elite group of politicians in the world. But others have to struggle to survive, especially in the poorer nations, scraping by in lives that citizens of Night City would be familiar with. The blending of corporate and government lines continued in the EEC, but in favor of the government, with members of the Council and the Secretariat using their positions to enrich themselves and achieve their own ends despite the power of the corporations. Companies that want to do business in Europe quickly learn to remember who is boss. Those that understand that fact often find themselves given access that other corporations would envy. Those who forget that the Council is the ultimate authority in Europe soon find themselves consumed by the capitalistic system, their rivals finding all the best contracts, while their own mysteriously dry up. Things remain in this relative status quo even in 2077. The EEC is the wealthiest, most powerful political entity on Earth, sitting firmly in the role of superpower. But this power and wealth comes at a price. Their society operating under a level of draconian regulation that would make George Orwell blush. There are those within the EEC that strive for a better, reformed future, but they are a persecuted underclass working against the tide. Fortress Europe still holds in 2077, and this might honestly be one of the only reasons that the EEC has been able to cement their power. They still struggle under environmental disasters, with flooding as climate change continues out of control becoming endemic, and forcing many citizens of EEC member countries to become refugees. The EEC military has even begun to engage EEC citizens who have tried to migrate to richer countries like Denmark. Besides news of this turmoil, however, which we get from news stations in Night City, from N54 News, which is a heavily Militech-controlled news station and is probably spewing propaganda, we don't really see a whole lot of Europe in 2077. So besides understanding that they are struggling under these environmental catastrophes, and understanding that Fortress Europe still holds, that they are wealthy beyond belief, but that they are also maybe the most totalitarian state on Earth, there's not much else to know. Hopefully, we can get a look at Europe in upcoming DLC. There are several European characters in Cyberpunk 2077, and there is a spaceport in the city. And I'm sure you guys have realized after watching this video how important the European Space Agency is, so who knows? We might get a chance. What I do know is that I have rambled long enough. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. It honestly does help out a lot. Check out the Cyberpunk lore playlist that I have. But alright, chooms, take care of yourself out there, and remember, may the Force break your chains.